The key to what we're reading today, learning today, is that word surrender. And we have Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as an example of perfect surrender. But that's hardly a picture of weakness. I mean, the man was about to... It has been historically celebrated in art and music and scripture and literature ever since. The extraordinary self-offering of his physical body for the salvation of others, however you understand that, whatever you understand that to mean. I mean, there's a self-realization explanation of that, but however you look at that, for him to go so willingly into a situation that by any human standard was appalling, it's really hard to fathom. The end of that story of the Garden of Gethsemane is when he is with his disciples there, and Judas, who was one of his very close associates, now we just paint Judas as a villain and lose track of the fact that he was one of the 12 apostles, specifically chosen by Jesus to be one of his own. That Judas has gone and traded the betrayal of his own master for 30 pieces of silver. And then he brings this cohort, this Roman cohort of armed guards who come in the night. Now the disciples have been there all night with Jesus. Jesus has been alone praying. The disciples have been exhausted by who knows why, and they're trying to support Jesus, but they're just sleeping on the rocks instead. And then everybody is brought to wakefulness by this armed group coming, who probably were not bothering to be careful or kind. Where is he? We want to take him. We're here to have him. And Jesus' disciples start to fight against them. I mean, now wouldn't that be natural? Even if they weren't able to stay awake all night. Here's the rabbi who's been taking such good care of him, and the enemy, which is this occupying a military force, which is what the Romans were as far as the Jews were concerned. This occupying military force comes to get him, and they start to fight. I mean, they were not without courage. They were not without dedication. And then Jesus stops them. No, this is meant to happen. Now, that's not the life most of us are living. Fortunately, we're not being awoken in the night to be dragged off to our deaths. We're not usually standing next to someone we love very much and we love very well and having him dragged off and having to decide what to do. I mean, those are horror stories that many people on this planet live, that we in this country have not often lived. We hope not to ever have to live it, but you don't know. But nonetheless, the drama described there, each in our own little tiny way. I mean, not tiny because it fills the screen of our own consciousness. It's the Gita talks about humility, humbleness, as being a really sign of divine favor. But we have to understand that just merely to consider ourselves, to try to just eradicate our sense of ego by stomping on ourselves is not really the truth. Because we're neither this great, wonderful, perfect being that we aspire to be, nor are we just nothing. We're sincere, we're well-meaning, sometimes we're even good. But all the time, we're in a situation where God is calling to us, be awake, be with me. Don't just give in. Don't just feel that, oh, I can't do it, I'm just going to sleep, I'll take care of it tomorrow. This is the way incarnations go by. It's so astonishing just to see how fast time can pass and how that day just never comes. So the symbology of being right there in the garden with Jesus, and Jesus understanding how much is at stake. Now the drama of the story makes it easy to think, oh, there was a lot at stake. But really all that's ever at stake is what we're going to do with our consciousness right in this moment. And every one of those decisions is the deciding point for what's going to come next. And so often on the spiritual path, people will raise a kind of global issue. Well, how can I draw my mind away? I did a webinar the other day, and the question I got was, how can I withdraw my consciousness from mind stuff and concentrate on the vibratory reality? I mean, it's not, my mind doesn't go in those directions. But we always like to make the question really big, because then we can sit around and contemplate the really big question. But the reality of who and what we are and what we actually experience is determined by such small things that we neglect the battle at hand in favor of contemplating something more interesting. That's the simple thought that it's better to fail at your own duty than to try to succeed at someone else's, is to really pay attention to what's right there. And it isn't possible, and this story about Jesus is also so touching, because Jesus doesn't reprimand his disciples. He does say, couldn't you have watched even for an hour with me? He asks them, but what you hear in that is more the sadness of his understanding how long this process of self-realization is going to take. So we have this strange sort of balance that we're working with, which is we would like to think, if I was in the Garden of Gethsemane, I would have stayed awake. I would have been able to do it. And then we have the sort of fear inside of us that maybe I wouldn't have. And the way Swami puts it so lightly, how much they must have regretted that weakness. And that even with Jesus, with Judas and with Peter is what I was going to say. In the Last Supper, Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. And he looks at Judas right in the face and he says, that which you are about to do, do quickly. And he, in essence, gives Judas permission. All right, you're going to play this out, just go do it. Which eventually, so many lifetimes later, when Judas recovered and was self-realized, Master told us, was freed. Can you imagine the tears that he must have wept? As it comes to him what he's done? Because that too, and that reference of Swami's here, oh, the disciples must have lamented that, is also telling us, sort of predicting for us what this pattern is going to be. God is going to call, the spirit is willing, that famous phrase, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And then, how they must have lamented that. But then, in the end, even that lamentation is not really the solution. Because we can just lament and lament and lament and lament, and it sort of becomes like the coin of our redemption. I'll just suffer and sorrow, and that'll do it for me. That's what we say in the Festival of Light, isn't it? Whereas in the past, the coin of our redemption was suffering and sorrow. It's a very, very interesting phrase, and it's not merely saying, because the rest of that is, whereas now that payment has been exchanged for calm acceptance and joy. We like that part of the festival, because that says, I can just be happy. I don't have to be miserable anymore. And we sort of just kind of go right to that. Oh, look, we have a free coupon now. Freedom, no suffering. We like that a lot. But there's also a much more subtle statement in there. And it's represented by the fact many years ago, 1977, Swami Kriyananda, twice in that year, went on a nationwide tour, I think it was 1978, drove around the country in a motorhome, went to 30 different cities twice. And the fruit of that, among others, was David Praver. He found lots of wonderful devotees on that trip. But his theme, which he repeated over and over for the first time, was the practice of joy. 30 times in 30 cities he gave the same lecture, same title, never the same lecture. The practice of joy. And what he was really trying to say to everyone is that it's not that when you finally get it straight, you get to be happy. It's the dynamic application of joy to every situation that is the answer to it. And there's this thought that is really based on this whole story. Well, Jesus was crucified for heaven's sakes. Well, he was crucified for heaven's sake, really. Jesus was crucified. He was tortured. He was humiliated. All these things. And who are we to presume to do better than that? And it's almost like, how dare we be happy? You have this very peculiar sort of thought that if I'm too happy, in some way I'm violating the life of Jesus. And Mother Teresa, at the end of her life, they put out all these letters in which she just continually insisted how miserable she was. And Swamiji sort of says there's just something really odd about that, because she was such a dedicated person. But Swami sort of, he wasn't proclaiming this, but he's speculating. Maybe she just felt it was just, she just couldn't be happy. Or at least she couldn't admit to being happy. Because after all, look how Jesus had suffered. And so we tend to have this thought that even when something is revealed to us that we've done wrong, that suffering and sorrow is the way to our redemption, that we're obligated then to feel miserable. I had this experience with Swamiji I wrote about in my book where I thought I had overcome a certain difficult karma that I had. And I realized that I had simply not had to face it for a long time. And in not having to face it, I just kind of thought that it was over. Natural assumption. And then circumstances shifted and I was right back in the context. And as soon as I was in the context, wham, I just hit the wall. I had developed a stinky attitude just right away. Just like no freedom from that karma. And I was so upset. I was actually weeping. I just couldn't believe that I was still here after so much effort, so many years, and just so happy to not have to deal with it anymore. And then there I was. Why are you crying? He said, you should be very, very happy. He said, you didn't know that you had to deal with this anymore, so you weren't putting any energy into it, and now you know. That's good news, isn't it? You see how everything can just be turned? Just the slightest little turn, and that which we're causing to make us feel so down and depressed, and even more deeply, this egoic sense of obligation to feel down and depressed. That's really our biggest enemy. Because that's the ego trying, in one way or another, to keep us out of divine awareness. Master said once to one of his disciples, whenever you have moods, and he meant moods of sadness and depression and lack of self-worth, whenever you have moods, Satan has a hold of you. And isn't it so often when we're moody, we feel just slightly self-righteous about it? Oh, here I am, especially when it's a mood of personal failure. Well, here I am, at least I'm making myself feel terrible. Swami used to tell me that all the time, that I substituted guilt for any actual effort to change. I didn't have any idea even what he was saying. I heard his words, I wrote them down, but they didn't mean anything to me because, and I really have come to understand it only relatively recently. Guilt just does several things that are really terrible. One is it identifies you ever more deeply with your error. Not only did I commit this error, but now I feel so guilty about it that we just take with a stamp and we imprint, I am wrong, I am a sinner, I am hopeless, I am all these things, which is not the coin of our redemption. The coin of our redemption is calm acceptance and joy. But you see, it takes tremendous will to resist the call of the ego to say, yes, the kingdom of God is everywhere, but the door is barred to you. And what we have to surrender, as Swami says here, is we have to surrender our ego identification. We have to surrender our identity with our weaknesses and allow the divine to come in. Isn't that exactly the opposite of what we think? That's why Swami Master tells us, Master says, you should give God your successes, But you should also give him your failures, and he's especially pleased when you give him your failures. Because when we give him our failures, people always think of that as meaning that we give God, well, I mean, that's what the words say. We make him responsible for our mistakes. Just a moment, the thought was too subtle, I lost it. Let me find it again. But what we're really surrendering to God is our identification with those mistakes. Lord, it happened. No doubt it happened. And this is the finest line, because you have to be so detached that you can be perfectly honest. Oh my, we did really mess up in a really big way this time, didn't we? You know, look at all the trouble we caused, look at all the people we hurt, look at how badly the project turned out, all because of my mistakes. I mean, these things happen. Once I just got so misled in something that I was doing at Ananda Village. This huge project involved a lot of people. It was supposed to be a fundraiser. Turned out to be just a disaster. It was a mess from start to finish. And I just couldn't quite figure out why. And when I sort of said something to Swami, this didn't turn out the way I hoped, he smiled at me so sweetly. Yes, he said, when your ego gets involved, you always make terrible decisions. Just like that. But he said it so sweetly. And then I could suddenly see, yes, starting back at the beginning, it just started off on the wrong foot, wrong motivation. And from that, everything else followed. Intention was wrong. And you know, these things really happen. And it really doesn't serve us. I mean, that's why one of the signs of the spiritual success that says in the Gita is humility and truthfulness. It really doesn't serve us to try to protect ourselves by saying it didn't happen, because it happens. It's interesting, Swami Kriyananda being so relaxed about himself, because there's no self for him to protect, he's told us stories about being very advanced spiritually. Shanti in his vrittis is how it was put to him once. Shanti means peace, vrittis are the whirlpools of karma. Shanti in the vrittis means Sabbakalpa Samadhi is what it actually means. It means just there's nothing, no disturbance to the consciousness. And then falling from that state. Because he said he argued with his guru. I mean, Swamiji is just the personification of personal perfect discipleship. And he says that he was highly advanced in previous lives, argued with his guru and fell from that and then had to come up again. Of course, as Master says, from such a high state, even if you fall, you wake up pretty fast and you can move back forward again. But sometimes I think about that. My goodness. You know, if such a great soul can get misled by Maya, wow, we really don't have to feel so bad. This is not such an easy story. And what we really have to surrender is just our concern about the fact that the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. And once again, you're walking one of those razor's edges, because you can't allow that calm acceptance and joy to become low energy and passive, because then you're moving out of truth again. It's not that we don't say and make the resolution, never again, when my master calls will he find me sleeping. Never again, when the divine asks me to serve, will I collapse in weakness. We can resolve with all our strength, but then when we stumble again, we just pick ourselves up and move forward. I believe last week I mentioned, you know, Swamiji is always, he's always so encouraging. He's so honest, but he's always so encouraging. Just whatever it is, you'll get it right. I was with him in Los Angeles for the last few days, and he just said, imagine, he said, you look at the most miserable person. How did he say it exactly? It doesn't matter. But he was bringing the picture forward of somebody who seems miserable and, you know, nothing in their life is going right for them now. And he said, and just imagine, he said, the bliss they will feel when God realization comes to them. And then all of that suffering will just be gone. And I've felt for many years that whenever he looks at us, you know, we look at ourselves and we identify with all those mistakes, the one I made this morning, the one I made yesterday, just everything, big or small. I look in the mirror, that's what I think of. My own self as this complete confusion of light and dark. But when Swamiji looks at us, because that's how he's trained himself to see everything, all he sees is the bliss presence of God. And more than that, he sees within us our own waking up to that, which is even more profound, which is the day that we ourselves walk away forever from anything but that knowledge. That's what it is that we surrender. We surrender the ego's identification with all of these ups and downs. That's where Jesus was. This world was a very sad place for him at that point, because the whole dark drama was going to act itself out again. And that's what he was praying about when he said, "Let this cup pass from me." He wasn't trying to be allowed to stay in his body for another decade or so. That didn't mean anything to him. The cup of sorrow that he didn't want to have to drink was that all of these people were not going to accept what he had to give them. That was the bitter cup. But then this divine acceptance, Swamiji also was saying that yesterday, we go through so much. He said, but when you finally are free of it, you realize it was never there. It's not merely that it was okay. It was fine. It was worth the climb up Mount Everest because now I reached the top. It was just never there. It was just a complete misunderstanding. God was always loving us. We were always infinitely blissful all the time. The only thing we have to surrender is our misunderstanding of that. What a glorious possibility that is, isn't it? And what's so dear about it, you see, by humbleness, truthfulness, harmlessness, recognition of the true nature of life, all those beautiful virtues described in the Gita, by living those realities, it becomes our reality now. God bless.